So Annie, thanks very much for coming on the podcast. Very nice to meet you. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you.
Are you nervous? Are you all right?
A little bit, always nervous.
Yeah, I understand. Before we go into your story, which is one of resilience, I was speaking to my son last night who's only 9, and he was asking, Dad, what does resilience mean? And I was actually trying to think of different words that describe it. And the best one I could come up with is courage. Do you know, courage to not let something break your spirit and break you down and overcome it, and that's obviously what you've done, and we'll all learn more about that shortly. But with my guests, I want to go back to the start. If you want to tell me a wee bit about yourself and where you grew up and how your childhood and life was up until now.
Yeah, sure. So as you can tell, my accent. Yeah. But I was actually born in Inverness. My parents are both Scottish. Right. So I lived there till I was about 3, and then we moved to Barbados and lived there for a good few years. Then London, back to Barbados. And I've been back in Scotland now for 23 years, and I haven't lost this accent. So travelled a lot, experienced a lot. My dad was in the RAF, so he travelled a lot as well. Grew up, I've got a brother and sister. They both lived down south, and my mum with my stepdad down south. So I've stayed up here, have a son, and loving life in lovely Scotland.
Brilliant. When I first spoke to you, I obviously heard the English accent within it, but you could tell it was mixed.
Different.
Yeah, there's something different. Yeah. And I was like, is it South African? Is it Australian? Is it New Zealand? But I'm glad you've kind of you've settled that now.
Yeah.
So how was travelling the world and staying over in different countries? Yeah,
well, mainly Barbados, London and stuff. Barbados was beautiful, obviously. Yeah. Everyone knows Riri. So growing up there was great. Got to meet a lot of people, a lot of celebrities. Friends with Rihanna's dad.
Really?
Yeah, so lots of experiences and different cultures. It's a very laid-back island, but there's lots of partying, lots of drinking, and you can get a bit isolated. So I did miss the city life. So it's got its pros and cons. You always want what you don't have.
Yeah. So what age were you when you went to Barbados?
So the first time I was about 3 or 4, and then I left when I was 7.
Right.
Went to London when I was 7 until I was 16, and then went back to Barbados until I was about 21.
So Inverness, Barbados, London, Barbados, 3 totally different ways of life.
Yeah.
Which one did you you must obviously prefer Scotland since you settled here.
Funny enough, Scotland and Bayesian people are very friendly. Like if you're at a bus stop, you say good morning. You know, London, not so much. You get looked at like you're crazy. So there's lots of similarities with Scotland and Barbados, just the weather. So obviously I'm drawn to the beach.
Just not the sunshine.
Yeah.
And how was it being the daughter of a military man? Was he working away a lot of the time?
No,
or was
he had just sort of retired from that, and my parents were running a hotel. But obviously coming from maybe that environment that he was in, he was quite a harsh man to grow up in, a household with, was violent to my mum and to us kids. So that obviously had an impact on us. So we all became very independent very quickly. So yeah, a harsh upbringing.
Did he was he interested as a father, or was he just there to instill discipline and that was it?
Yeah, no, he didn't really have an interest in us as kids. Never did any sort of drop off and pick ups from your friends or do homework with you. Never really wanted to go abroad on holiday or anything, because I think he'd already travelled so much, so it wasn't something he wanted to do much. We obviously had some good times. It wasn't all bad, but he never really had a positive impact. Well, personally in my life, I can only speak for me.
Yeah. So what was the age differences with yourself and your brother and sister?
So my brother's 18 months younger than me, and my sister's 3 years older than me.
So you're the middle?
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Were you all treated kind of equally?
No, we were all kind of treated a bit different. My sister, I think, harsher because she was the eldest. My brother, because he was the only boy, there was a lot of expectations of him, I think. I was the more vocal one when we were younger, but that obviously got me into trouble if I spoke up.
Yeah.
So we all kind of had our own different issues. I was quite a sensitive person, so I'm quite empathetic.
Yep.
So I would feel for whoever was, you know, in trouble or having a hard time, including my mum.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Firstly, do you have a relationship with your father now?
No.
None at all. With your mum?
No. With my mum, yes.
And your siblings?
Yeah. And I've got a stepdad as well now.
Stepdad as well.
Yeah.
Perfect. Got a good relationship with him.
Yeah, he's lovely.
And what about your two siblings with your father?
No, none of us have got any contact with him. He's in Scotland, in Glasgow, really? But we don't speak.
No crossing paths here.
No.
So the family moved back to Scotland as a family of five?
No. So the second time I went to Barbados, my sister decided to stay in London.
Right, okay.
So it was just me and my brother. And then my parents left Barbados and I stayed on for a few years by myself. I had a boyfriend at the time and friends. So my brother and my mum were in Scotland, but I went back to London for about a year, and then I moved up to Scotland, and then they left and moved to Surrey.
Right, okay.
But I had my son up here, and he's a very proud Scottish boy. So this is our home, and we'll stay here.
Settled here. Mm-hmm. Good.
Yeah.
Nice to hear that. So after your childhood was out of the way and you settled here, you got a job, went to university, had your son?
So when I moved here, I moved up here, got a job in Glasgow, had my son probably a couple of years after I'd been here. Yeah. And then I was at home with him for about 3 years, just being a mum. And then I got back into the working environment, which was in Glasgow, worked at Morgan Stanley for about 13 years. And that was me.
The reason, obviously, that you're on the show, Annie, is because you suffered physical and emotional domestic abuse at the hands of a serving police officer. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us more about that? Again, feel free to divulge what you want.
Yep.
And probably the easiest way is to do it chronologically.
Yeah.
So we can build up a picture of what happened, how you survived it, how you put it behind you, and how now in recent times you've actually used that to try and protect and inspire other women and survivors of domestic abuse.
Yeah. So first I'll point out that the police officer is not the father of my son. Yeah. So we met in 2013. I was at a wedding, bridesmaid, and he was at the wedding through the groom. I knew both the groom and the bridesmaid, the bride, and they sort of introduced us knowing that we were both single and kind of put us together. So straight away I had a bit of trust because I thought, oh, this is somebody that my friends know. Yeah. And so we met at the wedding. He introduced himself. We had a dance. We kept in contact through social media. Yeah. And then within a couple of weeks, we'd gone on a couple of dates. And then within a few months, that was kind of us into a relationship, really. He seemed really nice. I felt safe because, one, he was a police officer and, you know, my brother knew him prior to me as well and was like, oh, you'll be safe, Annie. He's you know, a police officer. I had a couple of relationships prior to that where there was a bit of abuse there as well. Not as extreme as this relationship, but they were there. So I was quite hesitant when meeting somebody at that point in my life. And so I totally put all the trust in and thought, great, I've met a police officer, I'll be fine. But within 6 months, I want to say, 4 to 6 months of our relationship, he became verbally kind of abusive or very bad-tempered. Yeah. And at the time he would blame it on the shifts because he was tired. Yeah. And I could understand, so I kind of made allowances. Yeah. You know, it's not nice having a few hours sleeping straight up and your shifts change to a different rota. So I had a lot of empathy for his shifts and his moods. But then it kind of started to feel that he was picking at me for just anything, like I was becoming his punch bag for his moods. And as I've described before, I'm quite vocal, so I always would challenge somebody for the way they're treating me, which is what I would do. I'd like, why are you speaking to me like that? And I think that angered him, the fact that I would challenge him. He wanted somebody that just sat there and took it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So that would lead into arguments.
Do you think that your kind of willingness to stand up to him stemmed from your experience of your father?
Yeah. I watched my mum growing up being very submissive and not wanting to rock the boat, because I could see in her eyes she would have fear that if an argument broke out with them, that could then have a ripple effect and affect us kids. So I would see her sort of be quiet and not say anything, and that really upset me growing up, and I certainly didn't want to be that mum to my son.
Of course, because it's catch-22 for someone in that situation. Do you be submissive in the hope that it won't make him angrier, or do you fight and stand up for yourself, but you run the risk of dealing with the repercussions of that? He almost would then feel in his perverse mind that he's got justification for whatever he wants to do because you've had the audacity to stand up to him. So it's a very, very difficult situation to be in. So was there a trigger for that, or is it when you moved in together, or did you get engaged, or was it just actually the first few months were an act, and then it just took a wee while for his kind of bravado to break down, and then the real person came through?
I think he'd what I didn't realise when I first met him is that he'd actually heard about me before we met.
In what way?
I didn't. So through our mutual friends, so they had explained to him, oh, this is my brother's sister, sort of thing. They mentioned, oh, she's single, this is her life story.
Really?
And I later found out that he'd actually looked me up on police systems as well. I don't know what the date of that is. So that's still undergoing investigations. So he knew a bit about me, but I didn't know to what extent. So I think he got to know my personality. He got to know some of the things I'd been through. And I personally now feel that I was targeted. Like, it was almost like, oh, this is somebody that I can kind of take control of, maybe, in his view. And I think he didn't expect me to maybe challenge him, which is why we clashed.
I mean, it sounds, people that maybe haven't experienced that or know anything about it, it sounds funny that someone would actually go out to target a potential victim that they can physically abuse. But you've obviously spoke about being in abusive relationships before, and that is something that I've found out in the past, that females especially that suffer domestic abuse in a relationship, it's very unusual for that to be the first and last time. There is a vulnerability there that perpetrators tend to pick up on. And I don't understand why, to be honest, but it seems that there is traits in some perpetrators where they'll just go out and target someone that they deem as weak.
I think since that relationship, I've had therapy. So I've had EMDR therapy, which is like a rapid eye movement therapy to get rid of traumas and flashbacks. I've had CBT therapy. And through my therapy, I've kind of learned that when you've grown up in a household with that environment, it becomes normal, even just somebody shouting at you or swearing at you. So when you've grown up in an environment where that's pretty common, so when you go into a relationship and they may be showing signs of that, you're not going to look at that as a red flag. You're going to go, oh, they're just in a bad mood. Oh, they're just. So I think some of that is maybe why people don't realise they're accepting behaviours that just the average person wouldn't accept.
Yeah, of course.
And then it's harder for them to get out of it because they're unsure of if they're over exaggerating or they're being a hypochondriac. You know,
totally. That's a very good point. That I never thought about that. But so you've actually learned or experienced the trauma in your childhood that initially makes you think that some of their behaviour might actually be normal. And if you're seen to, or if you think it's not normal, then you're second guessing yourself. Whereas someone that's not experienced that in their childhood, that's not used to hearing like everybody can have an argument, I don't mean that, but shouting, personal remarks, the swearing, the banging doors, the physical abuse, then they've not experienced that. So any behaviour that's like that is a red flag because they're just not used to it. I mean, I can relate to that. We spoke briefly, obviously off camera before, and the best day of my life was when my parents split up, to be honest, because it was such a toxic environment. And it suddenly went from myself and my two siblings, an older brother and sister, hearing the shouting and the arguing and the whatever, and then the next day it was silence. It was like peace, perfect peace. Nothing's happened. Nothing's going to happen. It was a bit of freedom from him. And like you, I'm very close to my mum and my two siblings as well. And I think the excuse for a lot of men is, or not necessarily men, that's maybe unfair, a lot of perpetrators, whether they're male or female, is that if they suffered in their childhood, then that's why they then do it in their adulthood, because one is seen as okay, and then they've almost learned that behaviour from whoever it was in their household that was abusing the husband or wife or the kids or whatever. So it's a difficult one to try and move on from. Did you ever question, like, did you ever say, like, why are you acting like this? You're a police officer, you should know better.
Yeah.
And what was he proud of that fact, or did he dismiss it, or was he one of these people that I'm sorry, it will not happen again?
I only really got sorries at the very beginning.
Right.
After that, it became, well, you know that annoys me. You know so it's my fault that I've said what I've said, or I've done what I've done. So it became my fault. And he obviously knew better because he was a police officer. He felt he was more educated in that way. So I used to make allowances. Like I say, I'm empathetic to a fault, and I'm not now. I'm a bit stronger. Yeah. But I could see that in his own childhood, he felt he would talk to me about feeling a bit neglected. He spoke about, his job bothering him and how that affected him. And I thought, I could show him the light. I could make him see life differently and have a different view. Yeah. And I thought if I could show him the way that he was hurting another human being, not even just the physical side, but the verbal, the mental side, that I think is probably worse in some ways. Yeah. I thought he would change. But I think all that did, naively for me to not realise, but all that did was give him more power, because he kept thinking to himself, oh, she's still staying here. She's not leaving. She's still wanting
to help me. She still thinks that she can help. It's obviously a horrible situation to be in, and I want to make it clear to anyone that's listening, and we spoke about this off camera as well, both of us have friends and know people that are in the police. This is not a podcast about criticising police officers in general. I don't want to discredit your story by thinking that you're just here to slag the police. It's not about that. It's about highlighting the fact that domestic abuse happens across all walks of life, and maybe behind closed doors that you wouldn't actually expect it to happen. So I don't want it to take away from what you've actually went through and it be more about let's get stuck into the police, because it's actually not about that at all. He being a police officer, he would have dealt with incidents from the domestic abuse from one extreme to the very most extreme, I would imagine. So there's no getting away from it. He knows better. He sees the fear, he sees the damage it does in families, not just to the victim, but their children as well. I mean, I know your son is obviously not his child, but was he present? Did you live together?
Yeah, so there was a period of time, we lived together for 2 years in total, but when we weren't living together, we were in each other's houses. Yep. So we were always together, really, if he wasn't working his shifts. So my son would hear the arguments. He would see the distress. They pick up on everything. He saw bruising on me and would question it, and I would have to go, "Oh, I fell over, son."
So you're always covered. You're always covered for.
But unfortunately, he did hear things. So that obviously affected him. And he went on to have his own anxieties and stuff like that from that. which is not great.
No, of course. So you were in a relationship from what year?
So September 2013 till August 2019 when he was arrested.
So 6 years. Abusive after the first few months?
Yep.
Okay. Obviously, I'm going to ask, and it's not a criticism at all. And again, people that don't know or never experienced it in their family, most people's comment was like, well, why did you put up with it for 5 years and 9 months? It's not as simple as that. Do you know, it really isn't as simple as that. He obviously had some control over you, whether it be fear, finances, just he had eroded your self-esteem and self-confidence that much that maybe you thought that it was the best that you could get. Or because you had witnessed that in your childhood, you had experienced it in previous relationships, now you're experiencing it again. Was there a part of you that just thought, this is just the way women get treated?
There was a little bit of all of those things. Yeah. I do think that for me, I genuinely loved him. And I think that played a big part because I did think I could see there was good sides of him. It wasn't that I had 6 years of this terrible person every single day. So I would see the goodness in him. And it was almost like I wanted him to just reverse some of that negative into positive. And I really did think I could help him. But every time I did try to say, right, I'm going to leave. I even found somewhere else to live. That's when, you know, he'd break down. I'm so sorry, I'm going to change. I'd get all the promises. So I would think, okay, he's seen the light, you know, he's going to change. And within 2 weeks, it would start back again. And I think at that point, I did get to a stage of like, I remember going to work every day like a robot. I was just waking up, I had no emotion. I was just going to work, coming home. And on the way home, I'd be thinking, okay, what's today going to bring?
Really?
And it was like I was always having to think ahead. And it was almost like I just wasn't thinking for myself anymore. I was just more thinking about the risks that I was going to face and how do I get through the day without...
So you would finish a day at work and you're on your commute home, you would be basically trying to think of how you're going to avoid potentially what's coming.
Yeah.
How frequent would you say? Obviously it would vary. I don't mean like it's not a thing that's scheduled, but how frequent would you say the abuse was?
Verbal abuse, probably weekly.
Right, okay.
Physical.
And when I say when you say verbal abuse, that's like that's not arguments. That's like personal attacks, name calling, shouting and swearing.
Name calling became pretty normal.
Really?
Yeah. And I think he even would say it and not even think that what he was saying was wrong. It was all the time. And I do think I'm quite a bubbly person, very friendly person. I had a lot of friends, and I do think there was resentment from him for that, and I think he wanted to crush that character of mine. Yeah,
totally. It's probably a character that he actually liked to start with. They obviously seen that you were bubbly, you could have a laugh, you had friends, a likeable person, but once he's got you, then he doesn't want anyone else to see that side of you. He wants it all for himself, sort of thing. You can expand or you can choose not to expand. What sort of stuff would they shout and call you?
I was a moron, I was pathetic, bitch, cow, a useless mother, useless girlfriend.
And these were just words that would just be...
This could be
just in conversation almost.
I put something in the wrong place.
Right, okay.
And I'm a stupid bitch.
Right, okay.
It just verbally came out naturally. So.
And did you feel that did their friends stick around, or did you feel that you were gradually losing them or getting pulled away from them?
Some of them were pulling away because I think some of them could see the way I was being treated and could not understand why I was there. Some of them didn't know what was going on and maybe had his side of things. For example, I had one of his colleagues was friends with me on Facebook, and I would like things on Facebook, like quotes that I would see, and maybe some of them were in relation to someone being abused or hurt, or I would like something or give someone a little love heart because I felt bad for them. And And I, at the time, didn't realise that other people would see the things that I liked, because this was a good few years back. And one of his colleagues had seen it, that I'd liked these things. And instead of thinking, oh, she must be going through something here, she deleted me off Facebook. And so when I spoke to my ex, Fraser, at the time, I said, you know, why she deleted me? And it turned out that she deleted me because she'd seen that I'd liked these things. Now, she was a serving police officer, and I was baffled at this. So it was almost like I had people turning against me when they realised what was going on, because they didn't want to either be associated with it or they just didn't believe.
So here was you online showing support for
other people,
domestic abuse charities or people that were experiencing that, and his friend who was on your Facebook friends, she was having none of it. She didn't like the fact that you were being supportive of victims of domestic abuse.
No. And when we did catch up a few months after that, we were chatting, and she was like, I'm so sorry, I just saw those things. And I said, you know, and I explained to her that my ex-partner Fraser was a really angry person and that we're arguing a lot. And I thought maybe if I opened up to her, she would have a bit of understanding. And her response to me was that in her relationship, she's the volatile one, and, you know, it's a stressful job that they're in. And it was almost like she was condoning his behaviour. So just to point out, like, a lot of people think, you know, especially some of the stuff that I've already done in interviews when I am talking about police and police officer and men, it's not just men that have this mindset and attitude. And for me to hear it from a woman totally made me feel isolated, because I felt, gosh, if this is a woman and a police officer that is not going to even entertain this conversation I'm trying to have with her,
then who can you go to, basically?
Yeah.
So was your son, did he have any relationship with Fraser?
At the beginning, they got on really well. When my son was a little bit younger and more oblivious to what was going on. As he got a bit older, into the early teens, he became a bit more aware, because me and my son are very close. And once my son kind of figured out what was happening, he challenged him himself and would say, don't speak to my mum like that.
Good.
And in return, Fraser would then ignore my son, not speak to my son, make him feel. So it was like he was punishing him. He was never physical with him, but he was verbally sometimes shouting at him or ignoring him to make him feel, you know, scared of him.
Yeah. So what age would your son have been roughly at that point?
13, 14.
So, and he had known Fraser for long enough to build a relationship, and when he questioned the fact, the way that you were treating his, that he was treating his mum, that was, he was disowned for a period of time as punishment, and I think your son never had that. That was his father figure at that point.
He's got his father that he sees 50% of the time.
Right,
Me and his dad have always had 50%. It's important, you know, I believe in that. So he has a good relationship with his dad, but obviously he really liked Fraser. And again, you know, when my son was young, he would put on costumes, and one of them would be a police uniform, and he wanted to be a police officer. He, you know, thought it was a great profession. And I think having this experience, being, you know, like a stepson to a police officer, has changed his mind. He doesn't think, obviously, all police officers are that way. But I think it was a shock to the system for a child to see a police officer behaving that way. I
think police officers out there, they're in a position of trust. There's no doubt about it, and they've got a power there that other people don't have. And certainly when they become what he became, they do so much. They have such a detrimental effect on people's trust and opinion of the police in general. Obviously your son, he obviously knows that not all police officers are like that, but he probably doesn't trust them as much as what he used to, and I'm sure his family and friends who know about it as well, it destroys the image of what the police should be and how they should help. And then in turn it also puts other domestic abuse victims off going to the police.
Well, there's all these campaigns like Don't Be That Guy, and you know, and it's all about speak up, go to the police if you're in trouble. But there is that sort of loophole where, well, what if it's a police officer? Who are you going to go and make that complaint to and have the faith that it's going to be dealt with correctly?
So talking about some of the incidents, obviously we've done a bit of research, we've had chats previous to that. When Fraser became physical, like how bad did it get? I know what he was charged with, I know what he was found guilty with, but can you talk us through some of the incidents? Again, if you don't want to, it's fine, you can have as little detail or as you can expand on it as much you want, or you can just skip on to the next one. What I don't want to do is trigger anything that might actually cause you a bit of distress. It's not the aim of the podcast.
It's okay, because I think it's important to speak up and say, because if people talk about it gives dialogue for people to have that conversation instead of people feeling, oh, this is a topic.
And also it's me asking about it. I don't want you to feel that we're just brushing over the physical abuse, that it happened, but let's not talk about it because it might be a bit uncomfortable. Some people might be experience the things that you experience and actually think that that's normal, and they might not choose to. They think that nothing can be done about it. But although it's not been easy, you did do something about it. On reading the outcome of the trial, then justice, if justice was served, then that's unlikely in my opinion. But at least he was found guilty. At least you have protection in place for yourself and your son. So although it maybe wasn't the punishment he deserved, it's still been worthwhile for you.
Yeah. I think it's important to see it through to the end, because as more and more people are convicted and you do see it through, because I think a lot of people go through the court process and then they back out, they can't go through with it, and that person then gets away with it, and that trauma's left with you forever, and I think it's important to change the system, and the only way to change the system is to show just how much this is happening. And one of the things that I'd mentioned in some of the things that I've done is police officers are trained to be these machines, just like in the army, to go out and face jobs. So they become a bit numb to things, and that's natural. But there's no sort of aftercare for them. There's no sort of mental health for them to sort of process what they've had to deal with and then deal with it themselves so that they don't bring that home to their families. So
that actually shows your empathetic personality, that you're actually thinking of ways where the police can better look after the police officers to stop them becoming domestic abuse perpetrators. A lot of people wouldn't think from that angle. So no, honestly, a lot of people would think, like, especially in your boat, it would be protect the victims, but at least you're looking at the wider problem and not just a reactive solution to when people report the police. You're seeing that there is an issue there, and it might be because police officers, whether you like them or not, they do have a hard job, and they see a lot of stuff that goes on behind closed doors that people won't understand. And it is likely to have a traumatic effect on some of them. And by no means is that a justification for mistreating people. But I think it does highlight that there needs to be some sort of care for the police officers should they be experiencing difficulty. Instead of taking it home to their partners, there should be an in-house kind of welfare programme where they can seek help before they take their problems out on their family, basically.
And I think as well for them to seek that help and not feel that that's going to jeopardise their career, because I do know of some officers that have wanted to get help, but there's like a grey area of, is that going to affect them progressing within the police? And so they tend to not do it, where it should even just be compulsory. If you've got officers that are dealing with very volatile, like he was part of the public order. So I know some of the training for that, they've got to stand there, have firebombs hit them, abuse thrown at them, and they've just got to stand there and take it. So that must affect people mentally. And I don't think they know how to switch off. And I do think that having people just mandatory, having something that makes it normal for you to have therapy, where it's not stigmatized that only one person's going for therapy or another. If it's just mandatory that all police officers get therapy and that's it, it's obviously a money issue, and maybe that's why it doesn't exist. And there's maybe the flip side of it, that if, you know, they're, I'd say building a machine, but, you know, they're making these people do the job and be strong in doing it, so they're not wanting to give them therapy and soften them, because then they're not going to be good at the job that they want them to do. A good point, So I do think there is a bit of both sides to it, but I do think that being in that role and having that authority and control can sometimes go to their heads a bit. But then there's also the element, I think, that kind of job attracts that kind of person that wants that kind of, you know, not all of them, but there is that as well. And it's been able for the police to vet better in who they're employing. I
think, like, we could talk about all the incidents down south with the Met and things, and I know they're a massive police force, but it's clear that their vetting procedures are fell short, like massively. I think we're a bit luckier up here with the sense that it's a smaller police force, and maybe the vetting procedure is better than what the Met has proven to be, but that doesn't mean it's perfect. There's a massive room for improvement there as well. I think even when you look at police recruitment drives now, they can't recruit. They can't recruit, and like any business, if they can't recruit, their standard gets lower until they can recruit, basically. And it's letting in people that are not of the right mindset, they're not of the right... they don't have the right tolerance for people, they don't have the right maturity levels, or basically, like you were touching on, they're attracting people that want to abuse their power and their trust. It's a really fine line between having enough police officers to serve the community and opening up the recruitment too much, where you're actually getting a lot of bad people joining. So going back to the physical abuse, what was the kind of... You obviously knew it was wrong when it was... you obviously knew it was wrong from the very start, but you thought that you could change him, that you could fix him. It was his fault, but kind of not his fault. It seemed that you were kind of willing to make excuses for him to an extent, because, as you admitted, that you loved him, you were in love with the guy. But there must have been a turning point where you thought, do you know what, like, enough's enough. He can't be helped. I don't want my son to grow up thinking that this is all right. I don't want him to think that his mum is not protecting him and that this is all right. And certainly you don't want your son to be copying that behaviour as well. So for the first sort of year, it was a lot of pushing, shoving, verbal. And then after that, there was like the grabbing of my neck, my collar, you know, like holding me up against the wall, holding the back of my neck and pinning me down. And a few times that would be like, say, on a bed or something. So once my face is down, I couldn't really breathe. There would be the twisting of my wrists and behind my back, almost like I'm being arrested, so that I couldn't move. Control, so obviously he's trained in how to restrain somebody. He's physically stronger and bigger.
So things being thrown at me, like remote controls, a cup, a mug, you know, food. And then the last sort of 3 years, there was a technique where he would pin me down on the floor, which I've now got injuries from, onto the side with all of his body weight on me. And then the only way I could describe it was the George Floyd scenario. But when he would do that, he would also put his hand over my mouth and nose to stop me shouting or screaming, and I literally couldn't breathe. So I'd be like convulsing, and you know, and at first it would be for a short period of time, but it would shock me into I just shut up and laid there until he got off. And over as that progressed, he would put his hand over my mouth and my nose for longer and longer, and it was almost like he's trying to see how long I can go before I pass out.
Yeah, how long can you get away with it for, basically?
So my ribs over the time became injured. So I used to get pain on my left side of the rib, and it would last a few months and then it would go away. And I just thought, you know, he's just bruised it, injured it. So eventually I went to the doctor. One of the occasions, my bottom rib on this side was broken. Went to the hospital. He was at the hospital at the same time. So I couldn't really say at that time.
He came with you to the hospital, and I take it that was so he could keep tabs on what you were telling the doctor, I presume.
Probably, yeah. So I couldn't sort of say, oh, this is what's happening. And so I just, said, oh, this coughed or, fell over. Like I can't, there were so many times I had different excuses. So my ribs started to get worse and worse, and my left shoulder. So I now have ascites in my left shoulder and a rip tendon. And I've got a condition called costochondritis in my ribs, which some people get when they've had a car crash with the impact.
Right, okay.
So some people could have it for a week, a month, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. So this has been pretty consistent for me now.
Still, it's an injury caused by the trauma of being the physical trauma
weight,
of his weight on top of you.
Yeah, so a physio had said that my left ribs are sticking out slightly compared to my right, and we don't know if that's just with the constant pushing and sitting on. So I'm in pain every single day. Like I'm at work, I've got a hot water bottle on. I don't really like medication, so I tend to walk about with a hot water bottle. So summertime is better for me than a winter time.
Yeah, of course.
So yeah, I carry that pain with me a lot. Which is not great.
No, it's constant reminders as well, because if you wake up and it's flaring up and you're in pain and you're having to take, well, you don't take painkillers, but if you're trying to relieve that pain by whatever means, you always remember what caused that pain.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Even though it's been a few years and there's no contact and you're safe now, it's still a reminder of what you went through.
Yeah. So as the time progressed, so that was kind of his main technique. But on the night that he was arrested, I had thrown a card down on the floor and he'd come up behind me, which I didn't know, and he went to choke me, so his arm went right round and I heard a click and he kneed me in the back and I just dropped to the floor and I just thought, I'm going to die now, this is it. And at the corner of my eye I saw my mobile phone. Now probably 100 times I went for the house phone, the mobile phone, and he would grab it, hide it, take it off me, convince me not to, because he's told me, I deal with domestics all the time, you'll get arrested, your son will go into care, So I was always fearful of how that was going to be perceived, because who's going to believe me? Yeah. So at this point I had a mobile phone on the sofa and I saw it, so I ran for the mobile phone. And he sort of stood there and, is she going to do this? So the minute the operator answered the phone, he bolted upstairs and started, what I didn't know at the time was putting a load of stuff in a bag that he didn't want the police to see.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Like what?
There was his passport was one.
Right.
And then there was lots of police stuff that he had that he shouldn't have had.
He shouldn't have had at home. There was one... There was an incident or instance that flagged up when I was doing some research that it headbutted you or repeatedly headbutted you. Was that same night or was that a previous?
That was a previous incident, yes. Yeah, so he didn't repeatedly headbutt me. Right. There was a few occasions.
Right, so it was several different occasions.
One of the charges that he was given, I think, was based on one of the nights of the headbutt, because obviously... to get a charge and be convicted of it, you have to have two forms of evidence. So one of the incidences was at a time that he did headbutt me and I bit my tongue. The top of my head was really sore and I did go to hospital for that. He obviously didn't know I did.
Right,
but what was happening...
So did you tell the hospital what had really happened?
Yeah, there's, I think, 3 occasions that I told the hospital what was happening. One was my ribs, one was the headbutting, and one was where... I was walking up the stairs and I still to this day don't remember anything, and I woke up and I couldn't see. I totally went blind, and I had to crawl down the stairs and he's standing over me, calling me all the names. I'm pathetic and I'm crying and begging him, please can you phone an ambulance? I cannot see. And he refused, said you're overreacting, and I crawled to get the house phone because I was like feeling my way to find this house phone in the living room. And he'd picked up the phone and took it away. So I crawled out the house to try and find my mobile phone in my car because I came home from work and I knew it was in my car.
Yeah.
Wasn't thinking I'm not going to be able to dial this because I can't see. But when I got outside, you know, he calmly came over and was, oh, let's get you in, you know. Just
because there was a chance that obviously people were watching at that point.
Yeah. And when the ambulance did come eventually, a woman recognised, I think, what was happening, and she whispered the paramedics and said, is he abusive to you?
Right, good.
And they took me to the hospital and got a record of that. But
So see, the occasions I must ask them, because obviously when you go to hospital and report an injury and you divulge that it was because of whatever, it could be an assault by another person, but in this case it's an assault by your partner. Did they refer that to the police on the occasions, or did they put it back to you?
They really wanted to. The first time that I divulged it was with my ribs, and the triage nurse begged me to let the police involved. But I said I can't because he is a police officer and they're not going to believe me. So she wrote her mobile number down on a women's aid leaflet and said, I don't normally do this. She said, but you seem so lovely. You don't have your family here. Just call me if you need me. And I never did. But it turned out 2 years later, she saw me again, and
for the same situation.
Yeah, she became a witness in the court.
Really?
So she was lovely. But obviously, when you go to hospital and you say that you don't want the police involved, I think they have to weigh up, you know, is it going to be more detrimental if the police got involved? Because what if something happens to me?
Yeah.
Or not? So
what happens if you go home that night and something really bad happens? I know that it is a difficult situation for them to be in, but they also have a duty of care to obviously treat your injuries, but to limit the chances of that happening again. Yeah. I don't know if it requires your permission or not, but I just wanted to make sure, and it seems on each occasion they at least offered. They obviously seen or heard. Yeah. It wasn't just a case they dismissed that and kind of left you to go back home with it. I'm glad you touched on that, because that was one of my questions next, the fact that like it was so difficult, and one of the main reasons that victims or survivors don't come forward is because so many incidents happen behind closed doors. And you're right, there is two pieces of evidence needed, and quite often there's not two, and it's basically the perpetrator's word against the victim. Again, on the research, there was a night out that you and Fraser were supposed to be going on, and you just had a big argument. You were in tears, and I think you had to phone a friend to cancel, and she became a witness in the case. Is that correct? So one of my friends, I'm trying to think of what you've read there. Yeah. There's different friends involved in different things. So there's one of my friends, close friends, she and her husband actually had known Fraser prior to me, but me and her became really close, and I had to cancel going out because she had arranged with her and her husband and me and Fraser. That's when I kind of opened up to her what was happening. So she would see the bruising on me. I eventually opened up to her, and she became, you know, her and her husband were trying to get me to leave him, basically. But because of the things that she'd seen, heard, like she would try and help me find somewhere else to live, she became a witness for that. There's different scenarios, like, for example, when he would do what he would do, he would record me. This is how it started. So after he would do, I'd be crying, I'd be hysterical, I'd be shouting, I'd be sobbing, and he would record it on his phone, and the next day he would play it to me and say, look how pathetic you are, listen to you, because he would be silent, so it would sound like I'm this hysterical person while he's standing there quietly in a room. That's so cruel. That's so cruel. How edited is that? Yeah. Do you know? And so my mum...
obviously was living down south. I'd opened up to my mum and she really wanted to go to the police, but she would never do it knowing that she could lose me if she did that. And she begged me to go to the hospital, and she also said, try and like put something on record when you feel that something's happening, so that you're capturing more than what because in my mind I was like, why is he recording me? Is this for him? Is he premeditating that in the future he's going to use this? And that's what it felt like to me. So
I think part of it will be, it sounds like he gets kicks from it.
Yeah.
You know, he can watch the videos back whenever he wants, and he can see how much control he has over you, and how much damage he's done to you, and how much he's eroded your confidence and your self-esteem. I mean, to do that, to record someone in the aftermath of being abused, to then blame them, look at the state of you, look what you've done. And I'm
convinced that he used those recordings to play to his friends or people to make out that I was this crazy girlfriend, because a few times I'd said I was going to the police, and on one of the occasions he went to his sister's house and told her, I think Annie's going to go to the police, here's a bag of stuff, can you keep this here? Right, okay. And she accepted it, and so he knew it was coming. He knew I was at that point where I was wanting to. So eventually I started to put like the iPad in between books, and you know, so in case he grabbed my phone, and sometimes my phone. So I managed to capture from like start to finish. So I would get everything that he'd done to me on that recording, and then you would even have on that recording him recording me.
Really? And this was an audio recording that you managed to get?
A lot of audios. There were some that were video, but they were in like a pocket and stuff. Yeah. So a lot of that was used as evidence.
Was the police lucky enough, or were they aware enough to seize his phone and use his videos against them?
I don't know. They never actually... There's lots of things the police didn't do.
Right, okay.
So they never took my phone. I literally had to put everything onto a USB and hand it to them. And then eventually they came and looked at my phone. They didn't want it off me. It was like I had to push it to them. Right, okay. But when it got to the time of the trial, the Procurator Fiscal had all of my recordings, and I said, he's going to have recordings and he might use them, which I was told that his lawyer did, and they were going to use them. And I said, whatever you do not make an agreement where you're not going to use recordings, because you've both got recordings, because that's what they do. Yeah. And I said, just don't do that. I said, because there's nothing that he will ever have on a recording that I've done wrong. I might cry, I might swear, I'm a human being. I said, but I've never done anything criminal on those recordings. So if they do try to make a plea deal to like get rid of them, I said, don't push for those recordings. So his lawyer never used his recordings. Of course, it was going to be incriminating.
Yeah, totally. I mean, all that's perfect. That's why I was asking. To me, that's perfect evidence of the damage that he's done. It's not like you had too much to drink and you're having a bad night and you're emotional. Like everyone can be. Yeah. This is literally the aftermath of an instant where you've came to harm, and he's captured your raw emotion on camera.
I think somehow it was to give a perception of me. There was one occasion after he did what he did to me, he was due in work for the late shift, which was a 2:00 start. So he was going to be late. So he went upstairs, made a phone call, came back downstairs and said, right, well, that's me not going to work. He goes, because if I don't show up for work, they're going to show up at my door looking for me. And then he said, I've had to say that you've had a mental breakdown. So it became all my fault that he could not go to work because I was laying on the floor injured, hysterically crying. So his manager, sergeant, inspector at the time would have received a phone call from him where he's telling them, oh, my girlfriend's having a mental breakdown, I've got to stay at home. So it's almost like, I think he wanted this picture to be that I've got this crazy girlfriend. Yeah, of course. Mentally unstable.
And all he's doing there is trying to reduce your credibility. When if anything was to happen at the time, whether it was you telling a friend, you telling the police, or you giving evidence in court, what he was trying to do is reduce your credibility down to where people either seen that you were actually pretty unstable or you were just a liar, and what you were saying wasn't true, and he was this perfect man. Yep. I think we digressed a wee bit just from the initial instance, so I'm just keen to learn how he came to be found guilty. Obviously, there's the hard evidence of the video recordings. I presume that you had injuries that were photographed and things.
Yeah, there was injuries, lots of bruising of injuries, lots of hospital records.
Was the bruising? Do you think that what he done was deliberate to the point where the bruising was contained in areas of your body that are not seen?
Yeah, it was never the face, other than when he headbutted me. But when he headbutted me, it was more up the top of my head.
Within the hairline?
Yeah. But everywhere was generally my arms, my torso, my legs, places that I would cover up.
Did you photograph them yourself at the time on any occasion?
Yeah, my mum, at the same time when she wanted me to, not obviously because I wasn't going to phone the police, she was wanting me to go to the hospital and start taking pictures, and she would get me to send her the pictures and then delete them off my phone in case he found them. So that's why I was doing that. It didn't naturally come to me, I'm going to, take these photographs, because I was ashamed and embarrassed. It wasn't something I wanted to keep.
No, of course.
I never thought that I was ever going to use them in a court trial. It never occurred to me. Even when he was arrested, I felt bad for him. And it took a long time for me to get to a place of, hold on a minute, he deserves it, and he actually deserved more than what he got.
Yeah. So tell me about, you touched on the night that you phoned the police. Tell me your experience from phoning the police to when he was arrested. And then obviously chronologically just during the trial. I take it he pled not guilty to everything? Yeah. So which obviously then means that you need to face him in court?
Yep. So obviously phoning the police was a really scary thing for me, which is I've had to have therapy for, because it was so ingrained in me that if I phoned the police, my son would get taken off me. I'm not going to be believed. So it took a lot for me to do that. Once I'd done it, when they first appeared, there was 4 of them. And obviously on the call handler, I told them he's a police officer. I was letting him know so that I didn't have colleagues show up and treat me badly, because he's going to turn around and go, I'm a police officer, she's a nutcase. Yeah. And I was like making sure the call handler knew my situation. So these 4 officers came and they treated me in a way that it was as if I was bothering their night. It was like, I just remember seeing, like, I have flashbacks of it, and I just remember seeing these 8 boots all in a row just standing over me. Like, I had this skimpy little nighty thing on. I never once got asked, do you want a dressing gown? Do you want something to cover you up with? I was shaking, shivering. They were sort of standing over me like, what's going on now?
What was the sex composition of the 4?
There was male and female. I remember the one female that stayed on at the end, and I think it was 3 guys. But the minute I said, he's a police officer, like I said it again, and they were like, we're gonna have to phone our superior, because they're not allowed to deal with it because it's a colleague of theirs. So I had to wait for a sergeant to show up. So while they waited, one officer was kind of like looking around, looking me up and down. So it made me feel even more intimidated. Right, okay.
Was Fraser
not
there?
In that room, but
he was still in the house?
He was in the living room, where I think at their viewing point, where one of them could see. And eventually a woman sergeant came, and she kind of assessed the scene, spoke to Fraser, came to me, and she whispered in my ear and she said, has he done this before? And I sort of nodded, and then she went off and came back, and she said, I'm going to arrest him, and he's going to be in the jail because this was like early morning on a Saturday morning, late Friday night. So she said he'll be in for the weekend and he'll appear in court on the Monday, which didn't happen. Really? So he was interviewed like throughout the Saturday morning or whatever it was, and then I got a phone call at 5-6 in the evening on the Saturday to say that they'd finished interviewing him, and that they were going to be releasing him to an address that wasn't the address that we were living at, and would that be okay? And I was like, I don't really know the procedures. I don't know how this works. So I said, well, as long as he can't come anywhere near me. And so they did. And then it turned out that he didn't appear in court on the Monday. I got told at the time that paperwork went missing. So he didn't actually appear in court for another 3 weeks. And
so was he charged? Was he charged at the conclusion of that interview that night? No, do you know? It wasn't.
He was released on bail, and he actually showed up from what I know through mutual friends. So that was that weekend. The following weekend, he went and did 2 shifts the following weekend until on the Sunday, he then got suspended. But I think that's at that point when they realised this was more of a historical abuse than just that one incident.
Just the one incident.
And then it turned out that the inspector at the station was one of his old managers as well.
From a previous job. Okay, so the court case, he went 3 weeks later. I presume it was, I think they call it an undertaking, where they don't get held custody to appear at court the next day, but it's a specified date within the next few weeks. He went there, pled not guilty, and that started the long drawn out effects of the court process. How long did that take? Well, I mean, was there anything that happened between the initial arrest and the trial? Was there any other instance? I presume he was released. Although he was released, I hope that he was released with protection for you, bail conditions.
I was told there was bail conditions, but so on the Saturday, arrested, released to a different address. On the Sunday, his brother-in-law sent me a text message saying that he was coming to the house to collect stuff, and I said, well, what do you need? I'll give it to you at the door. And he said, no, I need to come in, get the stuff. He's very adamant. So I called my friend to make sure I wasn't on my own. He came, took stuff. And somehow I managed to get a flat within 10 hours of him being arrested. And I just emailed a rented flat. She then said to me, can you come for a viewing? Heard my story. She'd actually promised it to someone else, but heard my story and wanted to help me because she'd experienced something in her life. So fast forward, I left to go and see this house, and I got a text message from the brother-in-law saying, oh, I've took one of your folders by accident, because he took a load of folders that Fraser shouldn't have had, and said, I'll bring them back. And I said, well, no, now's not a good time. I'll let you know. And when I arrived back, the brother-in-law had been in the house without me there.
Right, okay.
So his brother-in-law had keys. So I think Fraser was in the area with the brother-in-law to get stuff out of the house. And then his colleague at work at the time, him and his wife, we'd just been on holiday to Thailand together. And his wife, in my view, didn't like Fraser very much, found him to be a bit of a male chauvinist.
Right, okay.
And she befriended me.
Can I just interrupt you for 2 seconds again on doing a bit of research? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was him. When you said there about him being a bit of a male chauvinist, there was an image that came up of him standing in a bar and he's wearing a T-shirt, and it's words to the effect of...
I taught Christian Grey all he knows.
Yes, exactly that. And he's pictured in a bar and he's standing against the bar, I think quite laid back with his elbow on it and a drink in one hand, and he's literally wearing a T-shirt that says, I taught Christian Grey all he knows, which is obviously from the film 50 Shades of Grey. And what age is this guy at this point? He's like, in his 30s, I presume.
Late 30s.
Late 30s. So it was just when you said about being chauvinistic and him wearing a T-shirt out like that, like he is like God's gift to women or whatever he's trying to portray himself as.
Well, throughout the relationship, there was, I found a folder that he had with initials of every girl that he'd been with and comments about every single one of them. I found a USB with videos, pictures that these girls had either sent him or he'd taken without them knowing. Like, there was lots of things that I started to find out about him. So there was another side of him that was creepy. And it wasn't until and I don't want to put these two stories together because they're not.
No, of course.
But the Sarah Everard and the David Carrick stories where there's a violent side and a sexual side.
Yeah.
And when he So basically he was appointed an Up To You program for domestic abuse, which he has not engaged in. There's no repercussion if you don't engage in it. So I don't really see how that's a punishment.
So that formed part of a sentence.
Yeah. So his social worker came out to see me, and they raised him as high risk. They said that he had tendencies like these other characters, and obviously some of the things I'd maybe described to them, some of the things that they'd seen themselves with him. But at this point, he still was saying, I've done nothing wrong. This is all her. She's a liar. She's, you know.
I think, I mean, I purposely never asked you about any instance of sexual abuse because, rightly or wrongly, I feel that you would have highlighted them to me had they happened. But I think that, I mean, sexual abuse is everybody's final straw, everybody's final line. But I think what people realise is that to be sexually abused, it doesn't need to be a rape or a sexual assault. I think the fact that if you're physically abusive to someone and you're mentally abusive to someone and you're still being intimate with that person, to me that's still a form of sexual abuse because the person's probably only been intimate through fear. Although they might not be forcing themselves upon them, it might not be what people would see as a stereotypical sexual assault or incident or rape. The fact that you are battering, hitting, headbutting, kneeling, choking someone and still in an intimate relationship, if you want to call it that, that's sexual abuse to me. I
haven't actually ever publicly spoken about this bit, but there was one occasion, I've spoken to it with my friends because it's something that plays on me, and I'd come home, we'd broken up, he was in one bedroom, I was in another during our relationship, and I'd been out partying with my friends, and I'd had a few too many, and when I don't really get drunk, I just get tipsy or I feel sick, but I just remember falling asleep on the bed, and I woke up to him, and it was almost like all of a sudden we're doing the deed, and the next morning he said to me, which was very unusual, and he just said, look, I hope you don't think I took advantage of you, and it was all very much like, because it was like I was half asleep, half, you know, and it's just something that sticks with me. I've never said, oh, he raped me, or that, you know, it was never part of my case, because one, it's my word against his, but when I look at the bigger picture of it, it was like, does he see me as vulnerable because I was sleeping, I'd had a few drinks, and the fact that he felt the need to say that to me the next morning, he obviously felt he'd done something wrong.
Yeah.
And I do think that the sexual side and the violent side comes together in some people.
I would totally agree. It was actually my mum I was speaking about a few days back, and we were talking about the fact that like it usually starts with obviously the emotional, verbal, mental abuse, but very rarely does it stop there. And then it progresses to the physical side of things, and then we were chatting about the sexual abuse. My mum was a social worker for years and dealt with a lot of things like that. And we both came to the conclusion that actually, like, it doesn't need to be what people think is, like I said, a sexual assault or a rape. The fact that you have so much control over someone, you're being physically abusive to someone and then sleeping with them. It's an interesting point that probably needs to be expanded more so by the people that make the laws and hear the domestic abuse and sexual assault cases and things. So taking it up to the trial, then obviously you gave evidence in court.
Yep.
Did your son give evidence in court? What age was he then?
Just before he was 16, I think.
Right. Okay. It's a big thing for a child to do.
It's not something I wanted for him.
No, but I think that if his evidence would have been short of yourself, I mean, his evidence would have been really credible, do you know? And if that was what it took to secure a conviction, then no one can ever fault you for that.
Yeah, my son, I think even in himself, you know, he wanted to do the right thing. And I'm very lucky that I have a son that's a good person, has good morals, and does right by people. And I do think that he could see what I was trying to do, and he wanted to make sure he played his part into making sure that the correct justice was given. I think he would have felt if he didn't do it that he might have been a part of why, and even though I tried to explain that wouldn't be the case, there was no pressure, but I think even for himself it gave him strength because it was his way of standing up for himself, and that took a lot for him.
Yeah, definitely. So at the end, what was Fraser found guilty?
So he had 4 charges, 3 for assault and 1 for threatening behaviour.
It was a threatening behaviour over a prolonged period of time.
Yeah. I think because of new law, he would have had a 5th charge, the new domestic abuse law that came in April 2019, but it was trying to get corroborative evidence. Yeah. There was obviously evidence there, but you had to have 2 at the same time, which for a lot of people is hard. Yeah, so... Yeah, that was his 4 charges. He got given 250 hours unpaid work, 3 years community payback, an Up To You program for domestic abuse that he didn't really do anything with, and a 6-year non-harassment order for me and my son.
Which is obviously still in place just now.
Yeah.
So am I right in saying that the sheriff was limited in his powers? The maximum sentence, custodial sentence, would have been 12 months that he had the power to issue in that summary court?
Yeah, in the summary court. I believe that he should have been dealt with in a solemn court, but that's another podcast, another story.
No, I get that. Yeah.
But yeah.
So the sheriff basically viewed the punishment that you've just explained as more of a punishment than the 12 months, which would have been 6 months.
Yeah. He wanted him in the system longer. He wanted him watched longer. Right, okay. And I know that he still goes for reviews every 3-6 months. And from what I was told, that because he'd been attending all of his social work appointments, they gave him a good review, even though he's not engaged, taken any responsibility. But the sheriff, even at that, disputed that and said, no, I saw the evidence, I was in the court, and I want him to stay longer.
So the sheriff,
yeah.
Was it he or she?
It was a he.
Yeah, he.
Yeah.
So he basically... his hands were tied to an extent. He's seen the guilt obviously in him, and he basically done the best that he had the power to do.
Yeah, from what I know, yeah.
So this obviously, I think that the adversity hasn't defined you as far as how your life has developed. It's more your reaction to those incidents that has signified where you are now. You're moving on. Obviously, it's a long process, and you'll probably never be able to put it to bed. These things are always going to be in the back of your mind as far as even moving forward into new relationships or whatever. But how are you coping with it now? I know that you're campaigning for change with regards to how domestic abuse victims or survivors are heard and the laws that are in place. Tell us a bit about that.
There's a few different things I've worked with Edinburgh Uni for a research that went to Parliament, and it was to sort of speak about the processes that people experience right from when they reported to the police all the way through the court, and what changes could be made to make things better. Like, I was made to go through the same court entrance as him, with him right behind me, even though I was going into a court with a petition between us. It was like pointless. Right, okay. So there was lots of things that could be changed to make that process better for people. There is he looked me up on a police database. I'm not sure. I know when he admitted it to me. I just don't know yet when the date is. I'm still awaiting that.
So that's a complaint that you've taken with Police Scotland? I
have. So they found that he looked me up on the systems. That's fact. Yeah. Without bashing the police, I don't think all of the correct information was given to the Procurator Fiscal deliberately. So the Procurator Fiscal couldn't charge him because they couldn't prove that he knew what he was doing was wrong. They knew that he'd done it, but there was no training records. There was no so the professional standards are supposed to produce this evidence and hand it, and they did not. Right, okay. So
the Procurator Fiscal is basically saying that there's no debate on him looking you up on the police systems, but he could have been doing it for a genuine policing purpose. Was that what they were saying?
Well, even at that, there wasn't ever a genuine policing purpose. It's that they need to have the corroborative evidence to say, okay, he's looked you up, but also he had training to know that he shouldn't do that. So there's a bit of a dispute going on, where my complaint is not only really about him looking me up on the system, it's now how the police have dealt with that.
Right, okay.
So that's kind of ongoing, but there's a 3-year time bar. So if I want to claim compensation for my data breach, I have to make that complaint within 3 years to get any kind of compensation, whether that's civil through a court for Fraser or whether that's suing Police Scotland for my data being breached. So the law that I'm trying to get changed, that I've campaigned for, is I'm not going to get that for everybody, but for people that are going through domestic abuse, are not in a position to make that complaint. They could be putting their life in danger. They could, they're not... most people aren't even going to know that law even exists.
Yeah, of course.
So I'm hoping to try and see if that law can be changed for domestic abuse victims or survivors, so that they don't have that worry on them if they want to make that type of complaint. There isn't a restriction on when that has
of course,
to be done.
because there's so many people that experience domestic abuse. They don't go to the police. No. Like a lot of people don't go to the police forever. There's a guest coming on in a future podcast, a female, but she was in a lesbian relationship where the perpetrator was female as well, and it took her. So it took her 25 years to phone the police, and she was 77 when she phoned the police. So she had suffered domestic abuse, and from the age 52 all the way through to 77, and that was the first time that she had the courage or felt strong enough to be able to report the instance. And her story we'll soon hear. Just on kind of winding down the podcast now. It's obviously courageous of you to take, the fact that not only have you managed to get yourself out of that situation, you're also trying to make it better for people that experience domestic abuse now and in the future. From your experience, if you could say anything to people that were in your situation, hopefully, or obviously no one experiences that, but if there's any listeners out there that are going through something similar, what would you say to them to give them that kind of courage and resilience that you had to report it and get yourself out of that situation?
I think knowing how the system works, if you can get evidence, get the evidence, whether it's a third party, a recording if it's safe to do so. Things like evidence is what I would say. But the part about coming forward, it might not be the best thing for some people, but the more people that do come forward and the more reports of domestic abuse, the wider it's realised and change can then be put into place. If, for example, if they think, there's only 10% of abuse crimes, we're not going to bother changing the laws. We're not going to set out these campaigns. Yeah. But if people see that there's a lot of abuse and the more people that are standing up, then change can happen. And it's only ever going to happen if people speak up, but only if it's safe to do so. And if not, speak to a friend. Always have somebody to contact and communicate with. Have a friend, a family member, a charity, because you're not on your own. And 9 out of 10, when you speak to somebody, they either know of somebody that's been through it or they've gone through it themselves. Yeah,
that's what I was going to tell you. I mean, it's so common now. It's always been so common. It's getting better, as in the fact that people are speaking up more about it. There is more awareness there. I think that there was a generational acceptance of domestic abuse where that was just what was happened. That's what my granddad done, that's what my father done, that's what I'll do. And the same with the victims, they seen their relatives experience it as well. Just a couple of stats, like 65,000 cases of domestic abuse in Scotland every year.
And that's the ones about.
That's the ones that are reported. It's only 1 in 5 instances they think that are actually reported. So if you take that, then that's 325,000 incidents. 80% of victims are females.
I'd also say if any listeners that are not going through abuse, and they find out of somebody else going through abuse, everyone has different reactions, but what didn't help is saying to somebody, well, why didn't you just leave? So there's a bit of, I think, been able to have dialogue without being judged, and I think a lot of people feel they're going to be judged if they speak up. And if people become more accepting of that conversation with people will open up to them. So
yeah, I think you're spot on there, and I think that people need to be more aware that they actually can't help. Although people are so they don't want to get involved in other people's business, especially when it comes to relationship. And a lot of folk they'll know that something's going on, even family or friends or work colleagues. I guarantee through your situation, there could have been people that could have intervened earlier and helped you, but people take a stand back. So I think it's important for people out there to recognise the sign, learn the signs, and don't say, well, why are you still with them? Do what the doctor done or the nurse done. Slip your number if they don't have it. Give them some advice as to where you can go to reach out. Yeah. Just try and recognise the signs and obviously and be there. Annie, thanks very much for joining us. You're an inspiration to other people out there, and hopefully people take value from their story, from your story, and they can use it to help themselves.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. That's okay. Right.